that way we can say a big warm welcome for everybody tuning in to this awesome Becoming of Business dialogue where I'm sitting here with Claudia de Windt, and I am just so absolutely thrilled to have you here. We're going to talk about business evolution today, and we're going to do that leaning on your expertise as it relates to ESG, sustainability, law, international treaties, and we're going to dive into and encourage people to sort of lift their heads a little bit so that we aren't going from quarter to quarter, month to month, week to week, and we're forgetting about the bigger picture. It's something that I do see so much in business. And I am just thrilled that we can sit down here and encourage people to look, and we're going to shock them now, more than 1 year ahead, more than 5 years ahead. We're going to look at the trajectory of our choices today as people, and we're going to put some food for thought into our brain trust and the mind share of the world. Welcome so much, Claudia. I'm so happy that you're here.
Thank you so much, Linda, for having me. It's truly a pleasure to be here and talk about evolution and anticipating with you.
Oh, how wonderful. Can you enlighten us a little bit of what you do, because you have such a fascinating seat of, I feel like you're sitting on the entire ESG seat. Can you expand on that so people have you sort of on their maps a little bit?
Thank you, Linda, so much. So at IIJS, which stands for Inter-American Institute on Justice and Sustainability, we're a new model of business. We're a private venture with a public interest mission, social and environmental. And the reason for that is that we want to build bridges, and we build bridges between the private world and the public world on sustainability policy. So, how these standards, international agreements, the sustainable development goals can shape and are shaping behavior of corporate policy, and how businesses are integrating these global goals and commitments to add value to what they do and what they bring to society.
Mm. What an interesting position to have. So, you're very trained in looking at things long term. I do see that people who work with sustainability have a knack for thinking long term because we have to, whereas business in general has more of a short term focus. Now, what I have found perhaps a little, I'm not going to call it a bad consequence, but when it comes to talking about sustainability and especially climate change, and we're looking at this is what's going to happen 2030, this is what's going to happen 2050, it's easy that we get stuck on the alarmist view of it. And what happens as a mind trainer, I see this a lot with people. What happens, of course, is that we shut down because we can't take all of that in. So even though we're not here to talk about doom and gloom, we are here to wake up, and then we have to grow up and do the work. And where you're sitting today, when you have been involved from a legal standpoint and with an international view, you had made a comment before about how ESG has developed over time. Can you just bring us up to speed a little bit, what's happening there? And everybody's going to promise not to shut their ears because it's so hard to take in. But when you're in the work that you do and you see the development of ESG, what's new?
I think that what's new with ESG is really that we're putting a measurement to things that we already had there before. The consumer has changed their way of thinking, and we want to see how those societal values are reflecting in the products that we buy, in the companies that we are shareholders of, in the way that we live on an everyday basis. At the same time, I think it's important to say that 2015 was sort of a point of inflection because the global community realized that what we were doing with the Millennium Development Goals and all the ideas that we had about cooperating on the environmental front for the most part, but a little bit on the social, was not really coming together, and we were not making enough progress on those goals. And the main area was really poverty, which is an area that connects very much with business activity, especially in Latin America, where I work in the majority of my time in connection to the US and the European market. So in that year, the Sustainable Development Goals and the what's called the post 2015 Sustainable Development Agenda was adopted. And here we have 17 goals with key targets on all of these areas that are the life and blood of ESG. And they bring together the three dimensions of sustainability: the environmental, the social, and the governance. Because what we want to see with those goals and what they tell us that we need are strong institutions that are responsible and that are accountable for sustainable development. And when we talk about institutions, it's not just public institutions, that includes businesses, and that incorporates the whole concept of private sector diplomacy and the things that we do, for example, with a company in Mexico and how they connect with what a company in the United States can do in connection to those goals. ESG is not anymore what it was, corporate social responsibility, in terms of showing what am I doing for the world, but how do I internalize all of these challenges that we have globally, and how do I manage them as part of my operations, and how do I add value for my shareholders and for the different stakeholders that interact with business. It's about corporate citizenship.
Oh, what a beautiful explanation. Thank you for bringing us up to speed. And my mind immediately goes to another inflection point that happened as far as evolutionary thought went in 2015. So it's just kind of weird that this is the exact same time when evolutionary biologists looked at the survival of the fittest. And there's always been sort of a little rub about that, because nature is actually very cooperative, and they had revisited and looked at, but what is this really? And so they set out and had been working on this for a long time. In 2015, they came to and changed their minds about evolution, where they said that it wasn't necessarily that the survival of the fittest was wrong, but the definition of fittest had been wrong. Because it wasn't about dog eat dog and the strongest one wins. The definition that is now accepted as of 2015 is the fittest are those who collaborate, those who cooperate. And that's actually the same kind of wind that was blowing in your field as you came to that realization that it's more about the ESG, it's more about that citizenship, rather than here we're just going to report back on how we're doing so super well, which usually is the way that corporations will have it. So previously in the Becoming of Business, I conducted these circle talks, and Kurt Johnson, who is so many different things, but one of the things he is an evolutionary biologist, and he actually said, and I'm going to quote here, after he had presented these findings on how we see evolution differently now, he said, and I quote now from Kurt, "It's one thing to know that evolution wants to choose the thing that's best for the whole group, but it can't make those choices if in our work we don't put out the behaviors and the models that offer those clear choices." So this really brings us right into some of the three big questions that we're going to be examining here from your perspective primarily today. And the first one is talking about the trajectory of evolution. Now we're talking about 50 years from now, 100 years from now, and listen, we've been here. What the Big Bang was 13.8 billion years ago. And when we think about evolution, of course, we can almost get a little nauseous from how far we can look at this. But when we're raising our gaze into evolution, however far we're thinking about that, and we're looking at the world from your expertise, where are we heading? What are your sort of biggest concerns as to what the current trajectory is taking us?
So that's a very interesting question, Linda, and it's something that I struggle with every day, and it connects to something that you mentioned earlier, which is when we talk about sustainability, there's a tendency of being pretty gloom because the scenario, and if you open the newspaper, or if you now people don't read newspapers, sorry, but when you open your Apple News or the internet, all the things that we see are catastrophic. And if there was a time, there's a theory that's called the theory of risk by Ulrich Beck. If there was a time when that theory was more materialized, I actually think it's now because we have changes that are happening so rapidly and we have so many risks around us to which we have to adapt as human beings, and businesses have to adapt to those risks and to those changes as well. So I think that the scenario, to one degree, looks gloomy and looks like, we're not 50% of those sustainable development goals that I mentioned before are being undermined currently. The Global Stocktake report on climate tells us that we are not reaching 1.5 in terms of the temperature goal of the planet, and that's not even exactly where science tells us that we should be to ensure a sustainable path and a future for all of us. So it's a gloomy scenario. I won't, continue to go or delve more into that. But I do think that there is a chance because as human beings, we adapt. We adapt rapidly to change. It takes us a little bit because we're not coded in that way, but we are able to do it. And there are many examples in terms of business resiliency. Today, business are able to see what the risks that are affecting them are. We can forecast and we can anticipate, and they can build strategies. So we know more than we knew before. That puts us at an advantage. The Sustainable Development Goals and all the international treaties that we have negotiated and continue to negotiate and are adopting, the aim of the law and the whole governance framework is to drive human behavior and to change our behavior, to improve and to do better as a collective, as a society. And you also mentioned something interesting about this whole survival of the fittest. I think that we need to see society, businesses, the environment. We are all part of the environment as an amazing web that has been built throughout all those billion years, and that if one part gets weakened, the rest of it gets weakened. It's a net that needs to, wherever the weakest point is, that's where we are. So cooperation and solidarity are a key point, and I think businesses are the most relevant because it's where the power of change and where the power to change behavior lies in, and that goes to that whole notion of corporate diplomacy, the global commons, and the connections that we have everywhere. Interoperability also is a key word here.
Yeah. That's so beautiful, and that you are who are in the thick of this still feel hopeful that there are ways that we can work. And to me, as someone who of course I'm a mind trainer, but in that there's this evolutionary consciousness always on my part, and I really see that if evolution is guiding us to do what's best for the whole group, then the definition of what is the whole group needs to expand. I think that we are looking at a consciousness development in the world where, of course, there are those who are still stuck very much in an egocentric consciousness view, and that's the consciousness level where they are. More and more people are ethnocentric in the way that they can actually think about the group. The problem with the ethnocentricity level is that it's only my group. And so that other, and climate and how the planet is doing is not really confined by my group. And then what the other group does is not impacting me, right? And so the next step in consciousness development is a world-centric level. And I think that speaking of it then from an evolutionary standpoint, it seems like the move and the work that we're doing and that we're encouraging has to do to move from and beyond ethnocentric into the world-centric. I'm not saying that we don't have levels above that. We also have cosmocentric, etc. We'll get into that some other time. But for now, that's the move that needs to be made. Let me ask you, because you're in such an interesting position as you are trying to find solutions for basically the evolution of business and mankind. I mean, that's actually what you do on a day-to-day basis. What are some of the frustrations that you keep bumping into between, let's say, there are international treaties or agreements, or what's the frustration? Does it lie on a cultural differences level, or what is it? What do you see?
You actually read my mind because I was going to say culture, and when I say culture, I don't mean the culture of one country versus another or of one place versus the other. I mean society's culture, like as human beings, individuals, or thought process based on what you were describing of my group versus your group, lack of cohesion in terms of the value sets that we have as humanity. This sustainable development agenda, the concept around it of the rights-based approach is of no one left behind. Goal number one is about poverty, about eradicating poverty. So it means that we need to be inclusive and we need to incorporate all the groups in the thought process. But at the same time, and you probably are more familiar than me with this, we have the social dilemma in which nobody really wants to be the one that stays behind. I don't want to be a loser. I don't want to be the one that doesn't get the opportunity and does the best in X deal, for example. So I think that my biggest frustration has to do with the change of culture and the change of behavior that we need to see in society and in businesses. It's not happening fast enough. There are many places and many businesses that I speak to that understand that this is a priority that maybe is driven by regulation in Europe, maybe it's driven by the sustainable development goals, and they think that they have to change because if they don't comply with, let's say, the French due diligence law, I'm not going to be able to sell to France. Or if I don't comply with the new European reporting directive, I'm not going to be able to do business with Europe after 2024. But it's really not about that. It's change, because if we don't change, the resources that businesses depend on and that human beings depend on are not going to be there. Your business is not going to exist. I mean, it's a reality today that more than 40% of the S&P, the businesses in the S&P are located in key biodiversity areas, which are places that are at risk for loss of species or nature is threatened. And if you look at Latin America, where I work in, for the most part, the exports and the economy is really based on nature and on materials that come from nature. So if they're not there, we're not going to have business. So change happening more rapidly, change of behavior and culture. I would narrow it down to those two as the biggest frustrations.
And with those, then we can also begin to get a roadmap for if we can address those frustrations, we will also be changing the trajectory and where we end up. You know, the reason we talk about evolutionary trajectory here is that what might be relatable for those who are listening is that if you ask a pilot heading from JFK here in New York to LAX in Los Angeles, if they deviate from their flight path, their trajectory 1 degree, they're going to end up 45 miles into the Pacific Ocean. And I think that it's so interesting that that 1 degree difference can make such a huge difference where we end up. And so really what I'm hearing you say is that if we can address some of this, we actually stand a chance to end up just with those slight changes, we end up somewhere different. Would you, if you sort of had a call out to leaders, and it might also be those who are impacting regulation, etc., what is your big wish when it comes to the change that you want to see happening and encourage them where we would end up differently?
I think internalizing the thought that of what is good, what does good business mean? And good business is business that is good for people, for planet, and for the economy, of course. I mean, I think that having that mentality that is completely the opposite of checking the box because I have to is what I would like to see as a new business proposition. That's where I think that businesses should be going towards, that approach that is really the approach that humanity needs and deserves, so that we can continue to have hope, the hope that we need.
Yeah. And that super small switch, it's music to my ears, because instead of going from I have to, I want to. So that's really what we are leaving people with today for their evolutionary thoughts that I hope that we have elevated with this discussion. I know I've been very elevated in the way talking to you and understanding more about where we are with evolution of business as it relates to sustainability, ESG, what that really is. Thank you for double clicking on the poverty aspect of getting to a sustainable future. I still honestly think that is might be one that's hard for people who are in, of course, an egocentric but also an ethnocentric worldview where it's like, why does it matter if there are poor people in the world? Like, why would that impact me and my business? Do you want to address that just before we part? Just a little bit further?
I think, Linda, that poverty gets us into a vicious cycle. There is the social, the environmental, and the economic cannot be seen in a different way. And today we have different ways of even measuring poverty. Now we talk about multidimensional poverty. It's not only about how much a person makes a day, but whether that person has access to the resources that they need. And I think the same, if we have people that are out of poverty and that are healthy and that live in a healthy planet, we will have good business, and we will have, I think that also the importance of not having poverty has to do with something that we discussed briefly, or you mentioned earlier, about anticipating in sustainability, because the concept of sustainability has to do exactly with the fact that we have this planet on loan from our future generations, and we
Yeah.
have to give it back in the same way that we got it, or at least a little bit better. And I think that the connection with poverty, with reducing poverty, is going to help us with development. It's going to help us with having livelihoods and better economic well being. And it's going to help our planet adapt to the rapid changes that we have today, that we're starting to see and that are starting to impact us severely.
Yeah. And adding to that, perhaps the mental and emotional impact from poverty, which really drives people into desperation of crime, and we see refugees, and we see so many big impacts globally and locally from poverty. And I think that we're going to continue circling back to the quote from evolutionary biologist Kurt Johnson, where he says, we can't make those choices as it pertains to survival of those who collaborate if in our work we don't put out the behaviors and the models that offer those clear choices. And this is really about doing the thing that's best for the whole group. That is what we now have learned from evolution and evolutionary insight. And with that, I want to give just the one wrap-up thought, if you have one of those. Anything else that you want to put on your wish list for people moving forward? Any resources that you might think of that they might turn their attention to? Anything like that to wrap up our wonderful conversation today.
Thank you, Linda. I think that I just want to share one additional thought, which is that in order to get there and in order to have that change of behavior, we need mindful leaders, and we need leaders that can empathize with the needs that society has and how addressing those needs can contribute to business as well. And check us online at iijs.org in terms of the resources, and I look forward to continuing this conversation. I think the future is all about power skills, and power skills are all about people, communication, empathy, being there for others in the workplace and in the business place.
Beautiful. Mindful leadership, that is a beautiful note to end on. And thank you so much for taking your time, Claudia de Windt. And we'll, of course, post more about your bio and also where we can find your resources around here. Thank you again, Claudia. I'm so happy to have been in a Becoming a Business dialogue with you.
Thank you so much, Linda.